Thank you so much for your paper, Tony. My paper is somewhat related to Tony's paper in that I'm interested in the history of atomism as well. A little older than Epicurean atomism is Democritus, who's sometimes accredited with being the first Western philosopher to claim the soul decomposes like the body, but Epicurus modifies the atomism in some way, introducing random swerves to try to account precisely for free will, because he believes that that's necessary in terms of the way Epicurus thinks about free will. So he's trying to understand what must be the case if I'm choosing to do A rather than B, right? So the mechanistic explanation of a causal event chain that goes back all the way as far as you can go back, Epicurus makes modifications to Democritus's atoms, right? And later on, Epicurus is vilified by people like Cicero and others who say, you know, Democritus had this perfect system that had a mechanical explanation for stuff, and then Epicurus introduces randomness or chance into the physics. And then it's like an uncaused cause, and nobody likes an uncaused cause, right? Why does the atom swerve left rather than right? Well, no reason. Isn't there some reason down deep? So there's this peculiar feature of contemporary physics that introduces chance and indeterminacy at the quantum level. By the way, later I'd like to talk with you whether physicists really do claim that there are intrinsic properties of primary qualities down deep, because that's something that Brian Blaze was talking about when I was
have to read up first.
Yeah, but anyway, that's an empirical, factual question rather than a theoretical one that we could address too. So look, my presentation is entitled Wieland and Nietzsche's Use of Democritus as Role Model for Character Development. So I'm interested in the connection of atomism to ethics as well, which I take to be part of Tony's presentation because he's talking about the long subversion and hostility toward atomism. My book is on Nietzsche's philosophy up until he meets Wagner in 1868. And one of the things that Nietzsche was doing was reading a lot of atomism in the 60s. And so, my paper seeks to bring in a different Enlightenment thinker into the fray who was regarded as the greatest writer in the history of the German language at one time, or among the top two, he and Goethe. An Enlightenment thinker named Christoph Martin Wieland. So Wieland and Nietzsche both crafted literary projects to offer narratives about the significance of the ancient atomist Democritus. Both thinkers used Democritus as a vehicle to express something about the character of a struggling philosopher who has neither cultural nor institutional support. So in the history of theological Platonism, you know, they have institutional support. They have legions of transcribers devoted to copying over their texts. Democritus had no such schools, though. So each of their works, that is Nietzsche and Wieland on Democritus, tell us something about their own ethical ideals. Even though Wieland and Nietzsche have considerably different notions of virtue, both thinkers recognize that the historical accounts of Democritus are murky in terms of reliability, and both reflect on the neglect of Democritus in the modern era, as well as Democritus's largest significance for the Western philosophical tradition. Wieland's version of Democritus provides us an invitation to think about cosmopolitanism, or the ideal of world citizenship, while Nietzsche's version of Democritus offers the struggle of a truth thinker who clashes with supernaturalism. Both portraits of Democritus indicate that each writer invested something of himself within the story told about Democritus. So the stories tell us something about the values of each author. Neither Wieland nor Nietzsche became famous based on their Democritus writings, but both wind up valorizing Democritus's character. And the stories each of them tell about the ancient philosopher are significant for understanding each of their contemporary respective struggles, or respective contemporary struggles. Wieland's portrait of Democritus from the history of the Abderites provides a glimpse into the challenges posed to a cosmopolitan in a world dominated by narrow-minded provincialism. Nietzsche's analysis offers us insight into the depths of the struggle with the history of Platonism. So Wieland composes a fictitious account of Democritus's return to his native home of Abdera in his work The History of the Abderites, while Nietzsche examines the limits of literary scholarship for recovering Democritus's writing and thinking in his 1860s philological writings. So Nietzsche is sometimes accused, celebrated as well as condemned for him making up things about ancient Greek tragedy, specifically Plato and Socrates' role in being antithetical to ancient Greek tragedy, because ancient Greek tragedy shows the world without any moralizing tendencies. Bad things happen to good people and so forth. So Nietzsche's very famous for making up stuff about the ancient Greeks. Well, Wieland was doing that too, making up stuff about the ancient Greeks as a means to get to the limits of literary scholarship and then make up stories about what went down in the ancient world. In the Critique of Judgment, Immanuel Kant, so much better than the standard Kant and less clutch problems, but more transmission problems, Kant cites Homer and Wieland as examples of aesthetic genius, the latter of whom was widely considered to be one of the greatest of all German writers. Napoleon expressed this desire to talk with Germany's two great writers when he invaded Deutschland in 1808. Indeed, Goethe gave the eulogy at Wieland's death in 1813. Nietzsche was clearly influenced by Goethe, whom he hails as a European event, but there is not much evidence that Wieland had any profound impact on Nietzsche. However, both Wieland and Nietzsche reimagined ancient Greek philosophers in an attempt to retrieve something about the values and personalities of great thinkers in antiquity, right? Both are concerned with character development and who or what we may retrieve, which is important from the past. Indeed, Nietzsche's later work in The Use and Abuse of History talks about the extent to which we can overvalue historical studies, right? What is it that we're supposed to get out of history? Is it that we're just masquerading our hatred of the present as an extreme admiration of the past? And Nietzsche, as a philologist, was trained in a kind of historical methods where he winds up considering, well, how much can we get from the ancients? Well, how can they instruct us about what is meaningful for the present? Beyond the Democritus projects, both writers use ancient Greece as a setting to try to retrieve examples of excellence, to show that there are models of what human beings can strive for in the contemporary world. That's the value of history, because sometimes you have exemplary characters. Both Wieland and Nietzsche read the lives of the eminent philosophers by Diogenes Laertius carefully, and the text may provide us with the only virtual encyclopedia of Western philosophy which has survived from the ancient world, some of which Tony has cited from. For example, the letter to Menocius, where Epicurus says stuff like, we're fated to miss our own deaths. Diogenes Laertius has been ignored by many contemporary philosophers and historians for multiple reasons, one of which is the unreliability of some of the chapters which he preserves from the 7th century BCE to the 3rd century CE. And that's the chief source for most of the Pyrrhonian skepticism as well. Some other stuff that Tony was dealing with in his presentation. Earlier generations of philosophers knew this enigmatic text more, which seems to be constructed from earlier philosophic texts, and indeed some of Nietzsche's early philological projects. In his prize-winning philology essay on Diogenes Laertius helped him be awarded a doctorate in spite of never writing a dissertation. Diogenes Laertius preserves some letters, one of which is the Hippocrates-Democritus letter, a connection which Wieland employs for the fiction he writes in the history of the Abderites. So the history of the Abderites. Democritus goes back to Abdera, and he finds that everyone's petty and provincial and small. The letter from Hippocrates to Democritus is widely considered to be a forgery today, and it's unclear whether Democritus ever really met Hippocrates. However, all modern historians of philosophy regard the letter to Menocius as authentic, right? So it's a very enigmatic, peculiar text, Diogenes Laertius. Even if the parts of it are unreliable, he does exhibit a critical rigor at times by noting discrepancies in the tradition as it's been passed down to him. And he also lists works which were falsely attributed to some authors, including Plato, to authenticate which titles were genuine. Moreover, everyone regards the Epicurean letter as genuine. Near the dawn of ancient Greek philosophy, Diogenes Laertius provides details about the clash between the atomistic materialism of Democritus in the emergence of Plato's idealistic philosophy of immaterial forms. He also writes a couple of times about why Plato never once wrote about Democritus. Some people have argued that Diogenes Laertius is an Epicurean philosopher because of the disproportionate length that he offers Epicurus and some of the things he says about Democritus. So he says, for example, Aristoxenus in his historical notes affirms that Plato wished to burn all the writings of Democritus that he could collect, but two Pythagoreans prevented him from doing so, saying there'd be no advantage in that, for Democritus's books were already widely circulated. And there's clear evidence of this in the fact that Plato, who mentions almost all the early philosophers, never once alludes to Democritus, not even where it would be necessary to controvert him, obviously because he knew that he would have to match himself against the prince of all philosophers. So there's this record of Democritus being a super philosopher in the ancient world, recorded by Diogenes Laertius. So Diogenes Laertius is obviously not just reporting a history, but making value judgments about who the best philosopher was. And Nietzsche writes about this story of Plato wanting to burn Democritus's works in 5 different drafts in the mid-1860s. I'm not the greatest with languages, and I'm not a great scholar, but I was lucky when I was in Germany doing research at the Weimar archives, and shortly before that to discover some of Nietzsche's work that had not been ever translated into English. And my book, Becoming Nietzsche, has some of Nietzsche's work on atomism, and I think it might be the only translation into English. It was, at least 10 years ago. This invites one to think about extra-textual conditions for the transmission of philosophy, something that I take to intersect with Tony's work. Who burns others' works? Who copies the papyrus in the ancient world? How do political and ideological contexts establish which texts survive in a world which predates movable type, acid-free paper, and electronic digital storage technology, right? In the old days, you had to recopy all those texts, and texts were expensive, the papyrus rolls, they're not cheap. And there's no internet, put something on the internet, it's there for however long the internet will exist, right? It doesn't decay in the same way physical text did in the ancient world. So in Book 6 of Diogenes Laertius, we also find the first historical use of cosmopolitanism in the chapter on Diogenes of Sinope. When asked which city he came from, Diogenes responded that he was a citizen of no particular city, but he was a citizen of the world, a cosmopolitan, the first use of the word cosmopolitan. And so this is kind of, I think rather than the ideal of world citizenship, which the term cosmopolitanism in contemporary ethical discussions has, as well as in modern ethical discussions, it's probably more like Groucho Marx, right? Where he says, I'd never want to be in a club that would have me as a member. What city are you from? I'm from no city. I'm a citizen of the world, right? So he's more, because there's all these outrageous things according to Diogenes of Sinope, that he lived in a keg and he masturbated in public and peed on Plato, like just outrageous stuff that sounds like it might have even just been made up to tell a good story. So this is one of the reasons, by the way, that Diogenes Laertius isn't taken seriously by historians or philosophers, because he writes all this absurd stuff like Heraclitus being buried in dung and being eaten by dogs. It's like, what is this? It's almost, a friend of mine, Gary Allen Scott, once said that, Diogenes Laertius, National Enquirer of the ancient world, like Hillary Clinton is dating Bigfoot or something, like these outrageous stories are in Diogenes Laertius. But there's also, all modern biographies of Plato are identical to the history that Diogenes Laertius preserves. And so it's an extremely uneven text. And it's a funny text at times. Diogenes the dog purportedly lived in a keg, got into trouble for counterfeiting, and antagonized Plato. There is a larger significance to him in that it provides a history of philosophy from the ancient world which is neither authored by religious authorities nor is it dominated by Plato or later Platonists. It is worth realizing that all modern histories of Plato are pretty much identical to what Diogenes Laertius preserves. Nietzsche remarks in the Philosophy in the Tragic Age of the Greeks that we overestimate the significance of Plato and Aristotle because they never lack copyists and formal schools devoted to preserving and promoting their works. What is interesting about Diogenes Laertius is he gives us biographies and character portrayals of the ancient Greek philosophers from a different non-Platonist perspective. And, he talks about what Socrates liked to eat and that he liked to dance, right? And most contemporary philosophers, well, that's trivia. But Nietzsche's like, whoa, look at this is what, and so he tries to formulate psychological types, in a way doing a kind of psychoanalytic critique before the invention of psychoanalysis by Freud. Nietzsche tries to say, well, why does Socrates do these things? So that's a peculiar way to interpret the history of philosophy. But the idea that we could find a role model of how to live is important because philosophical inquiry can be used as a means to seek out a vision of how one can best live his or her own life. And recording personal details about the thinkers is something that Nietzsche uses to develop kind of personality types. Wieland's project of reimagining Democritus crafts a type of new Enlightenment thinking. He borrows historical details from the tradition and synthesizes them with a modern ideal of the cosmopolitan. So there's a great book that came out last year by Pauline Kleingeld on Oxford University Press called Kant and Cosmopolitanism. And Kant and Wieland were major cosmopolitan philosophers as an ethical and political theory in the late 1700s. But Kant gave up his racism, but I don't think he ever gave up his sexism. Unlike Wieland, Wieland apparently, he portrays Democritus as having a black girlfriend, and everyone disses him like, she can't be beautiful, she's African, and so Democritus, when he returns to Abdera with a black girlfriend, there's a sense that Wieland's portrait of the cosmopolitan thinks beyond gender division as well as beyond the standard categories of late 18th century Europe, the standard racial categories. Right? So historically, Democritus is usually credited with being the most widely traveled philosopher of ancient Greece, learning geometry from the Egyptians in northern Africa and purportedly journeying to India to train with the gymnosophists, the ancient naked Hindu mystics. In many versions of cosmopolitan thought, travel is significant, since it allows one to gain a more worldly perspective and equips one for understanding one's own culture better. Kant is often cited as the most important proponent of Enlightenment cosmopolitanism, so it is an interesting counterpoint to consider the fact that Kant never went anywhere outside of his hometown. If one considers Kant's lectures on anthropology, it's strange to consider that his claims about human beings and culture in general were never products of first-hand experience or fieldwork, but must have been derived largely from travel literature, the equivalent of flipping through old National Geographics. Nonetheless, Königsberg was a port city, and rivers provided a means for other travelers to form and inform citizens from other cultures. Global trade had already begun to make the world interconnected in important ways during Wieland's time, raising questions about international law, fairness, and justice, key concerns from both Enlightenment as well as contemporary cosmopolitan perspectives. Right? So Kant was very much adamant about trying to think about how the categorical imperative would not only apply as an ethical theory to individuals, but also entire nation states. And indeed, the founders of the League of Nations, they were all Kantians, right? So travel and port cities are not as important for contemporary cosmopolitan thinking as they were for Wieland, since the internet makes possible a type of interconnection which relies less on the necessity of physical presence, a point articulated by William J. Mitchell and others. Unlike other types of cosmopolitan thought, Wieland's History of the Abderites ascribes the cosmopolitan role primarily to the worldly sage, a position which may be somewhat inaccessible to the majority of the world. I'm teaching a course called Cosmopolitanism, the Ideal of Global Citizenship, and that's one of the questions we're wrestling with. Can everyone be a cosmopolitan? I think it's more challenging as an ethical theory because it requires you to know something outside of your own immediate environment. And people have enough trouble just surviving in their own environment and thinking about what is ethical, never mind asking, do I have obligations to stop suffering overseas someplace? Wieland also takes seriously the idea that all humans may be part of the same world community without regard to race or gender. It is not clear that Kant would endorse Wieland's far-reaching extension of cosmopolitan thought, since Kant never gives up his sexist orientation, and indeed appears early in his career to have even defended anti-abolitionist texts. But he moves on beyond that. But I don't think Kant ever gives up his sexism. Right? Wieland imagines an ancient state of Abdera in which Democritus is treated as an outsider when he returns, someone who is suspected of witchcraft and treated with hostility by most of the citizens in the fictitiously portrayed city of Abdera, a polis largely governed and peopled with fools. It need not be mentioned that Democritus' African girlfriend in the fairly egalitarian state for woman is a product of Wieland's imagination. Almost certainly was not the case in ancient Greece. Yet we are given a list of cosmopolitan values by Wieland. A cosmopolitan is, quote, not a seeker of honors, taken over by envy, not a miser, a usurer, slanderer, braggart, hypocrite, dissembler, secret accuser, ingrate, procurer, flatterer, parasite, slave, a man without head or heart, pedant, hair splitter, persecutor, false prophet, charlatan, financial schemer, or court fool. In short, the cosmopolitan is a whole bunch of, none of those, and is neither small-souled nor contaminated by pettiness or greed, and is a rare exemplar of a great and free human being. Someone who is at home anywhere in the world and is part of a larger community that is not dictated by geographic region or the accidental circumstances of being born in a particular location. Wieland's work offers us this glimpse of a plot hatched by Democritus' cousin to conspire to have Democritus declared to be mad in order to seize his estate. The conspiracy required someone to certify that Democritus was insane, so they call in Hippocrates, for whom the Hippocratic Oath is named, to deal with the strange atomists who seems to mock their customs. They need someone to make the medical judgment that Democritus is incompetent, but Hippocrates is like, no, you guys are all idiots, man. Democritus is... There's nothing wrong with him. They hit it off, and they recognize how much they share as worldly sages. So this reflects Wieland's regulative ideal of the cosmopolitan, which involves a community of sages. Wieland advances his view to suggest that sages are able to transcend the provinces from which they come to have a larger significance in an international community. Although Nietzsche does not have the same aspirations as Wieland's call to pursue a cosmopolitan view of universal brotherhood, he too attempts to reconstruct Democritus in his own image and is driven by a similar motive to recognize something great in the ancient atomists. Nietzsche referred to his own project in terms of a new enlightenment, or neue Aufklärung. So the common theme of valorizing reason is present in both thinkers, even if Nietzsche is sometimes portrayed as an anti-rationalist. I don't think that view is correct. Nietzsche uses arguments. In his training as a classical philologist in the mid-1860s, Nietzsche pursued an extensive Democritus investigation project, sharing some of the same interests as Karl Marx, since both thinkers, that is Marx and Nietzsche, both had huge scholarly Democritus projects when they were 22 and 23 years old, only Marx winds up defending Epicurus at length. Nietzsche's project on Democritus is much more scholarly than Wieland's, insofar as he tries to examine the factual limits of literary scholarship by scouring the remains of texts that survived from antiquity. Democritus was not only the most widely traveled philosopher during Socrates' life and probably all of ancient Greece, but he also wrote the most books. Nietzsche writes, and this is from my book, bad things have happened to the writings of Democritus, although they would be characterized as full of insightful judgments, as stylistic beauties, as model writings in their philosophic presentation. They would nonetheless be destroyed because in later centuries their justification would be felt as more and more strange, especially by Christianity, as it discarded the means to understand Democritus, since Aristotle had taken exception to Democritus' rejection of all teleological causes. When Aristotle talks of his explanations by four causes, Democritus is the whipping boy. He said, look, the atomists are so dumb they can't account for the design present in animals because they attribute everything to atoms colliding in the void. And this is why Christian scholars and monastic transcribers forced their hands away from preserving Democritus's writings, a plan which Plato had kindled to throw the collected writings of Democritus into the fire. Nietzsche writes, "I can no longer pursue investigation about the lost writings of Democritus to feed my appetite with nourishment, since they are irretrievably lost. We are guilty of the death sacrifice of Democritus, so we can finally silence his angry ghost. And thus, for whom would such help become other than for Democritus? Is Democritus's life not a martyrdom for science?" End quote. Nietzsche valorizes Democritus in his early philological work from the mid-1860s, exploring this antipathy between Plato and Democritian atomism. Nietzsche's later description of his own philosophy as inverted Platonism, in some aspects, can be traced back to his early exploration of the character of Democritus, a restless nomad committed to truth-seeking without any recourse to supernatural explanation. It is clear some of Nietzsche's research into Democritus was encouraged by Friedrich Nietzsche's emphasis on the atomist tradition for influencing the emergence of scientific method. And that's one thing that I think connects with Tony's paper, right? In terms of science, right? One of the things that atomism does is it rules out all supernatural causes, right? Trying to understand things in terms of material causes rather than spiritual or magical thinking. Modern atomism, of course, is very different in significant ways than ancient atomism, but the general approach to method is important, since ancient atomism requires ruling out mythological explanations. The ancient atomistic materialist perspective, which held that the soul dies with the body, has not been well received in the history of Platonism, something that I take to be, I think that's Tony's thesis. I'm not trying to ascribe a thesis to your paper, but okay, here's my short conclusion. I've already gone too long. Wieland and Nietzsche both looked to ancient Greece for a model to think about their own personal struggles with articulating a philosophy by which one can live. Wieland's work is especially interesting for contemporary ethical theory, since he addresses questions about what it means to become a global citizen. The recognition that travel allows one to think beyond one's own regional perspective suggests important questions for the role of a truth seeker. How important is it to travel? Is that a luxury which is accessible to only a very few? The recent resurgence of interest in cosmopolitan thought and contemporary criticisms of it invite further dialogue with Wieland. Pauline Kleingeld and Appiah have explored. Nietzsche also finds in Democritus a figure who mirrors his personal struggle to craft a philosophy which rules out mythology. It is a mistake to assume that Nietzsche has no ethics, especially when he calls for a new intellectual integrity, or Redlichkeit. He finds in Democritus one of the freest persons in the ancient world, someone beyond provincial pettiness, as well as someone who has a profound intellectual curiosity. Nietzsche's desire to find a meaning for life in this world is expressed through his philological work on Democritus during the mid-1860s. So, to conclude, Democritus was a hero for both Nietzsche and Wieland. They both struggled with the limits of what we could recover and actually know about Democritus. Both thinkers recognized the limits of historical recovery and then used their imaginations to go beyond that. Nietzsche found an early ally in his lifelong struggle against Platonism in Democritus, who was later known as the laughing philosopher, perhaps inviting comparison to the later portrait in Thus Spake Zarathustra of a this-worldly laughing sage. Wieland took greater license than Nietzsche's philology, however, since he was writing for a different purpose, to indulge the free play of the imagination, to invent a window into ancient Abdera in order to craft an image of how a wise man conducts himself, and also how he is perceived by others. The energy and time which Wieland and Nietzsche spent on Democritus suggests something even beyond their explicit comments which valorize him. The narratives they construct about the ancient atomists obviously tell us something about Democritus, but they may tell us even more about Nietzsche and Wieland themselves. Thank you. Okay. Sorry about going so long. So that's my Democritus, the secret influence paper.